I'm Ben Wattenberg. On July 4th, 1997, the NASA probe Pathfinder is scheduled to land on Mars. It will release a land rover named Sojourner to study the surface of the planet. Pathfinder, Sojourner, those are machines. Are they the legitimate heirs of Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus, Neil Armstrong? Joining us to explore that idea today are Robert Park, professor of physics at the University of Maryland and director of the Washington office of the American Physical Society. William Sheehan, a psychiatrist and historian of science, author of several books, including The Planet Mars, A History of Discovery and Observation. And Rita Colwell, president of the Biotechnology Institute at the University of Maryland and a former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The question before this house: should we send men to Mars? This week on Think Tank. The story of human fascination with Mars goes way back. The Egyptians called Mars the Red One. The Babylonians called it the Star of Death. Today, Mars continues to fascinate us.
Mars attacks.
They blew up Congress.
This could be a cultural misunderstanding.
It also raises a monumental policy question. In 1969, America sent men to the moon, not machines. It may well have been the defining achievement of the American century. That was then, now is now. Should we launch a similar manned effort today? The argument is made that human beings are exploratory creatures and that mankind needs big ideas and big projects to ennoble and inspirit society. The Egyptians built pyramids. In the Middle Ages, Europeans built cathedrals. Today, we build rocket ships. Further, the recent claims that life once existed on Mars have only whetted the appetite of the Mars boosters. But there is a counter-argument. Don't we have better things to spend our money on? Sending people to space costs a lot more than sending machines. Why not send machines and spend the difference for new medicines, or to teach literacy, or to explore the depths of the oceans right here on our home planet? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Let's go around the room quickly, starting with you, Bob Park. Why is there this current fascination with all things Martian?
Well, aside from 80 years of science fiction, which certainly has a lot to do with it, it is that is the one place in our solar system, with the possible exception of the moon Europa around Jupiter, that we think we might find either life or fossil life. It's been pretty well ruled out, I think, from what we know of the other planets. And so that is an incredibly important discovery, if it's there.
Bill Sheehan, you're a psychiatrist as well as a Martian student. Why the fascination, the urge?
You alluded to it in the introduction that you gave. Mars has fascinated people for thousands of years, and the intensification of that in the last 3 centuries as Mars has been found to be the planet that is the most Earth-like. By the 18th century, it was found to have what were then thought to be continents and oceans, polar caps, a rotation period similar to that of the Earth, and seasons. And about 100 years ago, there were also linear formations that were observed on Mars that proved to be illusory, but were thought to be the famous canals of Mars. And that triggered an enormous debate, which in some ways parallels that which we're going through right now.
That was just about when we were building lots of canals here on Earth.
The Suez Canal was built in 1869, and so there was a topical interest in canals. But I think that Mars is a place unique in the imagination as well as a place unique in the solar system, as Bob indicated.
Rita, Colwell, why are we all so sort of hung up suddenly on Mars?
Oh, I think that it's an opportunity to understand the evolution of life on Earth. As a biologist, it gives us clues as to how life formed. It gives us clues about life beyond this planetary system. I think it's an opportunity to sort of trace our history in biochemical and molecular genetic terms. But I think the main thing that it would do for us here as humans would give us a sense of the actual beginnings of life in terms of the chemistry, the structure, and the evolution to the higher forms that are here. Now that's presupposing that we find only primitive forms. We may have some surprises.
We should say that this is presupposing there is bacterial life on Mars, which is not a settled question. And I do think that that's the key question that we're going to attempt to find out, and perhaps the spacecraft will.
How far away is Mars?
It's closest to the Earth, 35 million miles. It never gets closer than that.
Pathfinder, scheduled to land on the surface of Mars on July 4th, 1997. What can we expect from this mission, from Pathfinder and Sojourner?
They, of course, are going to be looking for any evidence that there might be water somewhere, even if it's subsurface. Can there be any evidence on the surface? They will, of course, look for evidence of life, but these are not missions designed specifically to look for that. They're going to be looking for landing sites. They're going to be studying the geography. This is a kind of a cut-rate mission. Even the lander here is, it's landing with an airbag to keep it from being demolished. It's never been tried, and if all goes well, we'll be able to look at Mars through its eyes, and that's a wonderful thing to do. In a sense, we'll all be along on that mission.
What's the differential between, just ballpark, between sending up something without a person and with a person? Just
factor of 10 is the number that's often used, but it's in my experience, more than that.
I mean, from what to what?
$1 billion.
Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to do, but $1 billion is around.
So we could put a man on Mars or a woman or both for $10 billion?
I don't believe it. No.
I mean, I've seen estimates as high as 50, haven't I? I mean,
there have been estimates of almost $1 trillion.
So
that's why they gave the idea up some years ago.
So it's not a factor of 10 in that case.
In going to Mars, it's going to be much higher than that.
In fact, at this point, we really don't even have it worked out how that would be done.
We don't know if we could get people there alive.
Right. We've had people in Earth orbit for about a year, and that's the endurance record. It would take, as Bob mentioned, 9 months one way, given our current technology, to make it to Mars. So we don't at this point even have an experience with human beings being in space for that long.
Some of you have been arguing that it's too expensive and too difficult to send a man to Mars. We recently had occasion to interview an engineer from the National Space Society, Robert Zubrin, who has written a book about how to get to Mars on the cheap. Here's what he said.
If we want to go to Mars, there's a way to do it for a cost more on the order of 20 to 30 billion dollars. And that is by doing Mars in the same way that people have explored the Earth, which is by making use of local resources. Mars has got an atmosphere which is made of the ideal feedstock for making rocket propellant. So if you take advantage of that, okay, in the same way that pioneers on Earth have always taken advantage of living off the land. Lewis and Clark could never have crossed America if they tried to bring all their food, water, and oxygen for themselves and their horses with them. Okay? If you take advantage of this in space, we can do this much cheaper. So if you want to go to Mars, you don't build giant Battlestar Galactica spaceships filled with the propellant to come home. You go to Mars in relatively small spacecraft and you make your return fuel and oxygen there. Here's how you do it. Okay? With your first launch, you shoot out to Mars a medium-sized payload consisting of an Earth return vehicle which flies to Mars unfueled. You land this thing on Mars after an 8-month trip out to Mars on a low-energy trajectory, and then when you get there, you run a pump and you suck in the Martian air, which is 95% CO2. And you react that with some hydrogen that you brought with you from Earth, and in a series of chemical reactors that are very simple, okay, you can turn that combination into methane fuel and oxygen oxidizer. And now you got a fully fueled Earth return vehicle waiting for you on the surface of Mars.
It's kind of a preposterous idea. He says, look, we don't have to even take all the fuel to get back. We'll just make fuel out of the atmosphere, which happens to be carbon dioxide, which, that is, when I learned chemistry, that was the product of combustion. And but that's no problem, he says. We'll take along.
Some of the first successful explorers of the South Pole did live off the land. When the earlier ones took everything.
They ate their dogs. They took in a sense, they took the food with them and used it for transportation and then ate it.
Well, I think part of the problem is that some of the technologies he's talking about are totally untried.
I really don't think it's a matter of finding the kindling wood to build a fire and heat yourself. I think it's far, far more complicated, especially for returning. The return journey requires that you have to have sort of you have to have the same supplies and fuel and so forth to get there.
So
that has to be planned, I think.
So we could categorize this whole thing as pie in the sky, right?
Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, all right. Next question. So what is the argument for sending human beings to Mars? Let's get cut to the chase.
I think the strongest argument is sort of the Missouri Mule, the show me sort of argument that it's there. And the kinds of observations you can make as a human being are just far greater than you can make by instrumentation. The opportunity to do manipulations, to do experiments, it just is a much richer kind of exploration.
I would say that it's an intangible argument. I think it would be very difficult to argue for putting humans there in any utilitarian sense. Any more than it would make sense to have people up there with the Hubble Space Telescope. I mean, obviously, all of these things can be done in an automated form. It's much cheaper to do it that way, and one can, as with this space mission, send a lot of hardware up there inexpensively for the cost of doing a human mission. I think that in some ways we have to, if we're going to do this Mars trip, and given the expense of it, sell it as an adventure of the human spirit. We'll have to somehow capture the imagination of people and emphasize the fact that this is in some way an entertainment for an inquisitive and ultimately adventure-bound species.
I mean, this is sort of Spielberg cubed. That's the reason for it, because you could have a great picture show about it.
Well, I think that to some level we have to be able to do that, because I think that people watched the television broadcast from the moon and they saw the shadowy images of astronauts bouncing around up there and lost interest very quickly. So I think we would have to sell this as the 21st century analog to the cathedrals. The cathedrals were not built because of some sort of utilitarian purpose. It was.
But you would like to see human beings on Mars during your lifetime?
I've been fascinated with Mars my whole life, and personally, yes, I'd like to see it done. It would be an adventure.
You think it would be worth the cost?
Sure, I think there's a symbolism, just as Bill has expressed, of the human spirit and the exploration and the inquisitiveness nature of human beings. But more than that.
Your field is biotechnology.
Yes.
I mean, here you have this incredible experiment and adventure going on in biotechnology, the human genome, all the possible cures. Exactly. I mean, let's stipulate for the sake of this argument that we have a finite amount of funds to spend on exciting ideas. Why is it more exciting to go to Mars than to try to cure cancer or whatever? You fill in the blank, do great biotech things.
I think that one of the outcomes of landing on the moon was that it absolutely broadened the perspective, the imagination of the whole globe. I think it did something that was very important. It took us out of our own cocoon, so to speak, maybe to a larger cocoon, but it was a wider view of life in the planetary system. And I think this will just take it another saltative leap into space exploration. So I think it's part of human nature. With respect to your question about other kinds of experiments, that's going to go on anyway. And certainly we're not talking about going to Mars in a week or a year or several years. I think we're talking about iteratively developing the capacity technologically to eventually be able to do this. And I think we should have that as an objective.
I think that you mentioned the cure for cancer, for example. That's clearly something that's going to be incrementally achieved. The question of whether or not there is or was life on Mars is a question to which conceivably in our lifetimes we can get a yes or no answer. We'll be able to find out whether or not life was on Mars. And that is an extremely important question from a philosophical point of view. Are we alone in the universe?
Bob, the poets and the philosophers have spoken. Now it's your turn. All
Well,
right.
I like to think of myself as a poet and philosopher too, and I'm inspired as well.
But you have a checkbook that
I'm
you have to, right.
inspired by what we can find. Now, when a human being is on Mars, he's not like a human being on Earth. He's locked in a spacesuit. He has no sense of touch. He has no sense of smell. There's nothing to hear. The only sense he's got left is his eyes. And we can put better eyes than human eyes on Mars. And we can see through those eyes from here on Earth. It is not that we're putting a robot up there that has to do our thinking for us. We can react. We see what the robot sees. We tell the robot what to do. It's telerobotics. And that's why I say when we send a robot to Mars now with telerobotics, we're all along on the mission. And I find that as exciting and as inspiring as anything else we could imagine. On Earth, we do not send human beings down to investigate the interior of volcanoes or the deep, well, we do, but only to a very limited extent. We send robots down there. We drop robots down into deep holes in the ocean. And for the simple reason, scientists are accustomed to making measurements with their instruments. You don't stick your finger in a hot liquid to see how hot it is. You put a thermometer in. And we're used to sending our instruments. We can, every year, our robots, our machines get better. Human beings haven't changed in 30,000 years. We are a pretty fragile device to try to send to Mars.
Don't our little boys and girls need heroes and heroines to say, look at them, look at her, she's there?
But I'd even ask the question differently. Would you have been as excited about a robot landing on the moon than Neil Armstrong?
Well, I tell you, I had the experience. I took my students out to NASA to watch on the big screen live as we did the first flyby of Neptune. And my students watched that image of this eerie blue planet forming on the screen. They were every bit as excited as I had been seeing Neil Armstrong step onto the moon.
But I mean, if Columbus had been a one-way voyage and all it sent back was some television of San Salvador, would that have revolutionized the world?
Sure, if Queen Isabella could have sent a robot, she would have. Because it would have been a lot quicker and a lot cheaper, but she didn't know how.
Right. Do we need heroes?
Well, I think we do need heroes. I don't think that the impact of even the Voyager images, which fascinated me as well, was the same as the eyes of Voyager are not my eyes.
Bill Sheehan, you have written the title of your book is The Planet Mars, A History of Discovery and Observation. And you are a historian of science. Is there echoes of that go back thousands of years of people saying, well, we can't do it? Is that the rap on Professor Park?
We have barked up this tree before. People have been declaring the existence of life on Mars on incorrect basis for a century and more. So I think that there's, at least in my mind, a considerable degree of doubt that the findings about life on Mars are actually going to hold up. But I think if we do find the evidence of bacteria on Mars, whether currently extant, which would be more exciting, but if there are fossil bacteria on Mars and we can confirm that with robotic spacecraft, I think that then things will move to a whole different plane. I think then there would be a reason to justify perhaps the mounting of human explorations to Mars, because that would be a staggering discovery, the likes of which, it's very difficult to imagine what would have more of an impact. But I think that we'll have...
Why would that have such an impact if you said there are some bacteria on Mars? I mean, why would that change my life?
Two questions, and Rita can answer part of this, but just my quick response to that. The first thing that will have to be settled is, did life independently arise on Mars? Are these bacteria that originated there, or did they have a common origin? Since we have meteoritic material that has landed on the Earth, it's possible that life has been seeded through the solar system and may have started in one place. But if in fact life did originate on Mars independently, then that means that the preconditions for life are fairly common in the cosmos. And that doesn't mean intelligent life, but it means that the metabolism, the cellular structure, all of these things can be assembled within a relatively short time of the beginning of the solar system.
The original space program had some very practical advantages to the human species and to Americans specifically. It had a military application in terms of the Cold War. Despite all the talk about Tang and Team and Wing and Wang, what we did get was satellite technology out of it, which is
fantastic.
Which is
the
fantastic.
global positioning system being the latest of these. Sure.
Right. But I hear the optimists here, or the adventurers here, saying that we're going to learn something theoretical about bacteria, maybe. What is the payoff? I mean, why do you, well,
because
okay.
I'm as excited about that as they are.
Yeah, but you're not prepared to take as much of my money to do it. I mean, I am representing the great taxpayers of America. I mean, I happen to sort of agree with the optimist, by the way, but I'm on both sides. Yeah, but
I'm a taxpayer too.
I understand that.
But quite aside from that, I'd be perfectly willing to spend the money if it were the best way to do it.
So you wouldn't even send a manned mission to Mars if you had the money. You'd rather do it without.
Or just a better way.
Better way.
I mean, we're a bag of living organisms. You have one accident on Mars, and you can't do the experiment after that. There are more living organisms in my gut than there are human beings on Earth.
Yeah, but I have to say, Bob, that you kind of have it both ways. On the one hand, you are discussing how insulated and encapsulated the human being would be, and then at the same time you're saying that we'd be contaminating. I think
Depends on the accident.
Sure, yeah, of course. But I think the issue really is, as Bill had laid it out, is that it's understanding the ability of a complicated structure, which is a living organism, to have arisen independently, or whether the so-called theory of panspermia, which means the transmission of seed through cosmic space, that would seed all of the bodies of the planetary system. That's an old theory that was proposed in years past. But the notion still would be amenable to testing the hypothesis that there was de novo origin of life on Mars. And if it's very, very different, then it would give us some indication, perhaps of the extreme.
The difficulty is that if there is life, even microbial life,
It's microscopic.
it is very likely underground, because the radiation levels, again on Mars, which does not have a magnetosphere to protect it, are probably too high for anything to survive on the surface.
Well, again,
It doesn't have to be very deep.
As a microbiologist, I would take issue. We do have a bacterium species, Radiodurans, which has been isolated from nuclear reactors, where in fact it can withstand tremendous amounts of radiation. So do not underestimate the capacity of microbial life to live in true extremes.
And just to build on that, at one time, oxygen was extremely poisonous to living things. So I think whatever kind of Martian life we find, if we do find any, will have evolved to adapt to Martian conditions. If there isn't a reason to send people to Mars, the next place isn't very apparent on the horizon. There aren't a lot of other candidates.
Well, Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, and it's an ocean moon. Now the ocean is frozen, but there is a lot of evidence that in fact underneath that ice at some depth there is liquid water, and a lot of biologists believe if that's so, and that there is enough heating in the interior from the Jovian tides, that life would form there very well.
Having done experiments in the Antarctic, in the dry valleys where bacteria live in the rock and have only a very small amount of time per day in the, quote, summer, they'd still grow. So it would seem to me, if there is liquid, my bet would be that there's living bacteria.
All right, we have to close it out with that. Let me announce that you are all correct. Thank you very much, Bill Sheehan, Rita Colwell, Bob Park, And thank you. I'm Ben Wattenberg for Think Tank.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.